The deployment began before dawn, though dawn was a word that had lost its meaning in this part of the world. The sky stayed the color of old steel, and the water stretched out in every direction like a dark mirror. Aris stood at the edge of the launch deck, watching the first needle roll into position on its gantry. It looked almost peaceful in the dim light, its dark hull absorbing the weak glow from the ship's lamps. But he knew what it was about to do. He knew the cold and the pressure that waited for it. 3,000 meters down, the chief engineer gave the order with a single nod. The crane operator, a woman with steady hands and a face that showed nothing, engaged the lift. The needle rose slowly, swung out over the water, and then began its descent. It hit the surface with a sound like a whisper, sending ripples across the calm sea. Within 30 seconds, it was gone. The water closed over it, and the only sign it had ever existed was a faint trail of bubbles that dissolved before they reached the edge of the deck. Aris let out a breath. He did not know he had been holding. One down, 146 to go. The control room became his home for the next 3 weeks. It was a cramped space, tucked deep inside the ship, filled with screens that showed data feeds from the needles as they swam through the dark water. Each vehicle had its own code-named things like Anchor, Keeper, Sentinel, and each one followed a path that had been calculated down to the meter. The naval architect had spent months programming the routes, using old survey data and new satellite imagery to guide them through canyons and over ridges that no human had ever seen. But the ocean does not care about human calculations. On the 5th day, a needle named Visual lost its primary thruster. The data feed showed it spinning slowly in the deep water, its navigation system trying to compensate. The robotics expert saw it first. She was a quiet woman who rarely left her station, her eyes always on the screens, her fingers always ready on the keyboard. She called out the problem without raising her voice, and within seconds half the control room was focused on Vigil. "It's the port thruster," she said, her voice calm but tight. The motor seized. It can still steer with the other 3, but it's losing power fast. Can it complete its mission? Aris asked. She shook her head. Not as programmed. It'll run out of battery before it reaches the injection site. The silence that followed was heavy. Every needle was needed. There was no backup, no spare that could be launched to take Vigil's place. The entire mission had been planned around the precise placement of all 147 vehicles. If one failed, the whole chain would be weakened. The naval architect spoke up from the corner. He had been watching the feed over her shoulder, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. What if we reroute Sentinel? It's closest. It could cover Vigil's site and still make its own with a 20% power margin. That's cutting it close, the engineer said. If Sentinel hits any resistance, it won't make it back. It's the only way. Aris looked between them. He thought about the glaciers waiting below, the warm water carving tunnels under the ice, the families who had no idea this Armada existed. He thought about the young technician back in the mess hall who stared at her baby's photograph during every break. Do it, he said. The next hour was the longest of his life. The robotics expert worked in silence, rewriting Sentinel's mission plan while keeping Vigil stable. Her fingers moved without hesitation, her face illuminated by the glow of her screen. The rest of the team watched without speaking, as if any sound might break her concentration. When she finally sat back and announced that Sentinel was on its new course, the relief in the room was so thick you could taste it, but the ocean was not done testing them. On the 12th day, the weather turned. A storm swept up from the south, the kind that builds slowly and then hits like a fist. The ship began to roll, then pitch, and heave in ways that made walking impossible. Equipment slid across the decks. The control room, deep as it was, still groaned with the strain. 3 of the technicians became sick, but refused to leave their posts. They worked with towels wrapped around their necks and plastic buckets beside their chairs. It was during this storm that the support vessel named Prospect lost its engine. The Prospect had been stationed 20 kilometers away, acting as a relay for the Needle's signals when they were too deep for the main ship to reach. The call came through on the emergency channel, a voice, crackling with static, saying that the engine room was flooded and they were losing power. The chief engineer grabbed the radio herself. "Abandon ship," she said, her voice hard. "Get everyone into the life raft. We'll come for you as soon as we can." But the storm made rescue impossible for 12 hours. Aris stood on the deck with the others, watching the horizon, waiting for a glimpse of a life raft. The wind tore at his jacket, and the spray froze on his beard. He thought about the crew of the Prospect 7 people, all of them scientists and engineers like him, all of them volunteers who had left their lives behind to be here. He had shared meals with them, talked with them about their families, their fears, their reasons for coming. Now they were somewhere out there in the dark water, clinging to a small rubber boat, while the waves tried to swallow them. When the storm finally passed and the rescue boat brought them back, the first person off the life raft was a young woman who had been the Prospect's data analyst. Her face was blue with cold, her lips cracked, but she was smiling. The first thing she said was, "We saved the data. Every last bit of it." That night, the team gathered in the mess hall to decide what to do about the Prospect. It was still out there, adrift, its hull breached, its engines dead. If anyone found it, they would find evidence of the Armada. Schematics, communication logs, the names of the Needles. Everything they had worked to keep secret would be exposed. "We have to sink it," the naval architect said. He said it without emotion, the way a doctor might say, a limb had to be removed. There's no other way. No one argued. They all knew what was at stake. But the act itself was harder than any of them expected. The explosives were already in place. Every vessel in the fleet had been fitted with scuttling charges, just in case. The chief engineer gave the order from the control room, her finger hovering over the switch. She looked at her wrists, and he saw something in her eyes that he had not seen before. Doubt, maybe. Or grief. He nodded once. She pressed the switch. On the screen, the Prospect's signal vanished. The ship was gone, along with years of work, millions of dollars, and the only home the 7 crew members had known for months. In its place was a spreading patch of debris that would sink to the bottom and be covered by sediment before anyone could find it. The woman who had been the data analyst cried quietly in the corner. No one tried to comfort her. Sometimes Aris had learned there is nothing to say. The days that followed were a blur of deployment after deployment. The Needles went into the water in waves, each one following its programmed path, each one carrying a piece of the mission. The robotics expert worked until her hands shook from exhaustion. The naval architect double-checked every course correction, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Even Aris, who thought he had nothing left to give, found reserves he did not know he had. By the 21st day, all 147 Needles were active. They spread out across the Amundsen Sea, a silent fleet moving through the darkness. Some were already at their injection sites, releasing the silica compound into the upwelling currents. Others were drilling into the seabed, sending supercooled brine deep into the sediment. The data feeds showed the first signs of success, a slight cooling here, a slowing current there, but no one celebrated. There was too much left to do, and too many ways it could still go wrong. Aris stood in the control room on the final night of deployment, watching the screens with a mixture of pride and terror. The Armada was out there, doing what he had dreamed of for 15 years. But the world above knew nothing of it. The glaciers were still melting, the seas were still rising, and the people who had laughed at him were still in charge. He thought about the young technician and her baby. He thought about the crew of the Prospect, floating in the dark while their ship sank beneath them. He thought about the delegate who had mocked the island nations and the Yaw, families wading through flooded streets. The Armada was awake. But whether it would be enough, whether anything would ever be enough, was a question he could not answer. All he could do was watch and wait, and hope that somewhere in the deep, the needles were doing their work. The plane flew for what felt like an entire night. Aris had lost track of time somewhere over the Southern Ocean, where the sky was a permanent gray and the water below looked like ink. The pilot did not speak. There were no other passengers. The small jet had been waiting for him at the airstrip outside, long nearby, its markings painted over, its tail number filed off. Aris had climbed in without asking questions. He had learned long ago that some doors once opened do not allow you to ask for a map. When they finally descended, he saw it through the window, a massive vessel, dark and rust-streaked, sitting in the middle of nowhere. It was a repurposed deep-sea mining ship, a kind built to scrape the ocean floor for minerals that no one was supposed to take. Now it sat motionless in international waters, far from any shipping lane, its decks crowded with equipment that looked nothing like mining gear. A crane lowered a small landing platform onto the water, and the plane touched down on it with a jolt that rattled Aris's teeth. The first person he met was a woman who introduced herself only as the chief engineer. She was younger than him, maybe late 30s, with hands that were permanently stained with grease, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she had already taken you apart and put you back together in her head. She did not smile. She simply nodded, took his duffel bag, and led him through a maze of corridors that smelled of diesel and salt. "You're the last one," she said over her shoulder. "Everyone else arrived 3 days ago. We've been waiting on you." Aris wanted to ask who everyone was, but the words died in his throat when they stepped into what had once been the ship's cargo hold. The space had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a university laboratory and a submarine factory. Bright lights hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the machines below. And there, lined up in rows that seemed to stretch forever, where the vehicles dot, they were unlike anything Aris had ever seen. Each one was the size of a school bus, built from dark composite materials that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. They had no windows, no markings, no signs of human occupancy. They were designed to operate in complete darkness, at pressures that would crush a normal submarine like a soda can. A team of technicians moved between them, running final checks, their voices low and serious. A man approached Aris from behind one of the vehicles. He was older, with a face that had been weathered by decades at sea. He wore a heavy wool sweater and carried a tablet covered in technical diagrams. He extended a hand. "Dr. Thorne," he said, "I've read your paper more times than I can count. We built the first prototype based on your original calculations." Aris shook his hand, still staring at the machines. "How many are there?" he asked. 147, the man said. "We've been building them for 18 months. In secret, in 3 different countries. Each one assembled in pieces and transported here under cover of darkness." Aris felt something shift in his chest. For 15 years, he had been told his idea was impossible. Too expensive, too complicated, too risky. And yet here it was, in front of him, real enough to touch. Over the next few hours, he was introduced to the rest of the team. There were no soldiers here, no mercenaries. These were scientists and engineers, the kind of people who had spent their careers watching the world ignore their warnings. The robotics expert had been fired from a major defense contractor for refusing to work on weapons. She now designed autonomous vehicles that could navigate the most treacherous underwater terrain on Earth. The naval architect had spent 20 years building submarines for a powerful nation's navy. until he had walked away after being ordered to ignore evidence of rising sea levels that would flood his own childhood home. The biogeochemist had published a groundbreaking paper on ocean alkalinity, only to watch it get buried by a funding agency that did not want to upset the fossil fuel industry. They had all been mocked at some point, laughed at, dismissed, told they were alarmists or dreamers or worse. And now they were here, on a rusting ship in the middle of nowhere, building the thing that was supposed to save the world. Aris stood with them in the cargo hold that night, listening as they explained the plan. The vehicles, they called them the Needles, had two jobs. The first was to slow the warm circumpolar deep water that was eating away at the Antarctic ice shelves from below. They would release a specially engineered compound into the upwelling currents, a fine silica mixture that would increase the reflectivity of the surface water, creating a kind of shield that would keep the heat where it belonged. The second job was more direct. At key points where the glaciers rested on the seabed, the so-called pinning points that held them back, the Needles would drill into the sediment and inject a supercooled brine. The goal was to refreeze the ground beneath the ice, creating new anchor points that would buy the glaciers time. Not forever. Just time. Enough time for the world to get its act together. If it ever would. It's not a solution, the chief engineer said, her voice flat. It's a bandage. A big bandage, but a bandage nonetheless. If the world doesn't stop burning fossil fuels, nothing we do here will matter in the long run. But it will matter for the people who live on the coast right now, the naval architect said quietly. It will matter for my nieces and nephews. No one argued with that. The days that followed were a blur of work and waiting. The team operated in shifts, 18 hours on, 6 hours off. There was no time for rest, no space for doubt. Aris spent most of his hours in his small control room, monitoring the data feeds from the Needles as they were calibrated and tested. He watched the screens with the same intensity he had once used to watch the glaciers, looking for any sign of trouble before it happened. The hardest part was the silence. No one on the ship could communicate with the outside world. No calls home, no messages, no contact with anyone who did not already know the secret. The crew had all told their families they were on extended research trips or sabbaticals, or simply disappeared. One of the younger technicians, a woman with a gentle voice who had left behind a newborn child, spent her breaks staring at a photograph tucked inside her helmet. She never showed it to anyone, but everyone knew it was there. Aris found himself thinking about the conference in Vienna, the laughter, the way his colleagues had turned away from him when he needed them most. He wondered what they would say if they could see him now. Would they still call him a madman? Or would they finally understand that sometimes the only way to save something is to be willing to look foolish first? On the night before the first deployment, the team gathered in the mess hall. No one spoke much. They ate in silence, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them like the deep ocean. The chief engineer stood up finally and looked around the room. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start changing the world. No one will know it's us. No one will thank us. And if we get caught, the same people who ignored the problem for 30 years will try to put us in prison for trying to fix it." She paused, her eyes moving from face to face. But the water won't care about any of that. The glaciers won't care. The only thing that matters is what we do. So let's do it right. She sat down, and the silence returned, but it was a different kind now. It was the silence of people who have already made their choice and are ready to live with the consequences. Aris went to his bunk that night, but did not sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to the ship groan against the waves, and thought about the 147 needles waiting in the hold below. He thought about the warm water carving tunnels under the ice, and the families wading through flooded streets, and the delegate who had laughed at the island nations when dawn came, or what passed for dawn in that part of the world. He rose and made his way to the control room. The first deployment was about to begin. The secret Armada was waking up. And somewhere out there, in the frozen heart of Antarctica, the glaciers were waiting. The world had become a place of terrible waiting. Not the quiet kind, where you wait for a bus or for rain to pass. It was the kind where you watch the ocean creep up, street by street, knowing there is nothing you can do to stop it. That was the feeling that lived inside Dr. Aries Thorne every morning when he woke up in his small research station on the island of Spitsbergen, in the Svalbard archipelago. He was 62 years old, with a beard that had turned fully white in the last 3 years, and hands that still remembered the feel of ice cores pulled from deep glaciers. But those days were over now. Now he mostly watched screens. The station had been built for a different time. It was meant for studying the cryosphere, the frozen parts of the planet, with a small team of young researchers who came and went with the seasons. But funding had dried up 2 years ago, and now Aries was mostly alone. A young technician named Lina came twice a week from the settlement in Longyearbyen to check the satellite equipment, but otherwise he had only the wind and the data feeds. The data feeds were the worst part. They showed him everything he had predicted 15 years ago, coming true faster than even his most pessimistic models had suggested. 15 years ago, he had written a paper that was supposed to be his life's work. In it, he had argued that the world needed to stop thinking only about cutting emissions and start preparing for direct intervention in the Southern Ocean. He had proposed a system of underwater pumps and artificial upwellings that could cool the warm water currents eating away at the Antarctic ice shelves from below. It was a radical idea, and he had known it would be controversial. But he had not expected the mockery that followed. A senior scientist from a prestigious American university had called his proposal techno-hubris of the highest order. A British newspaper had run a cartoon showing him as a mad captain trying to steer an iceberg with a giant fan. The climate policy community had dismissed him as a distraction. Even his own university had quietly suggested he focus on more conventional research. He had watched the ridicule from the front row of a crowded conference hall in Vienna. He remembered the way people had laughed, not cruelly, exactly, but with that particular confidence of people who believed they were on the right side of history. They had called him a pessimist, a fearmonger, a man who had given up on the real solutions. He had sat through the entire session, packed his notes, and flown home without speaking to anyone. A few years later, he had taken the position in Svalbard, partly because the Arctic was changing faster than anywhere else, and partly because it was far away from the conferences and the committees and the polite laughter. Now, 5 years from that day, the laughter had stopped. The Pine Island Glacier in West Antarctica, which everyone had said was stable for at least another century, had begun to collapse in a way that nobody could ignore. Satellite images showed a crack the size of a small country spreading across the ice shelf. The front of the glacier was calving icebergs so massive that shipping lanes had to be redrawn. And the warm circumpolar deep water, the very current he had tried to warn people about, was now flowing beneath the ice at a rate that made the old models look like guesswork. Reese watched it all from his screens. The sea level data coming out of the Amundsen Sea region was unlike anything the scientific community had ever recorded. It was not a slow rise anymore. It was a jump, a lurch, as if the Antarctic ice sheet had suddenly decided to let go. Coastal cities that had spent billions on sea walls were now facing the reality that walls would not be enough. The news was full of images from places like Jakarta and Miami and Lagos, where water was coming up through the drainage systems, pushing salt into drinking water, forcing families to leave homes that had stood for generations. The worst part, for Aris, was the way the powerful still talked. He had watched a United Nations press conference 3 days ago, where a delegate from a major industrial nation had stood at the podium and mocked the representatives of a small island nation. The island nation's delegate had pleaded for emergency funding for a global effort to slow the collapse. The industrial nation's delegate had smiled into the cameras and said, "Your pleas for humanity do not supersede the laws of economics." The words had echoed through the hall. Some people had laughed. Aris had turned off the screen and sat in the dark for a long time. That was when he started receiving the messages. They came through a secure channel he had not used in years. A backdoor communication system set up during his early research days when he had worked with a handful of like-minded scientists who believed in what they called non-conventional intervention. The messages were short, coded in a way that looked like ordinary data noise. The first one had arrived 2 days after the press conference. It said only, "The old idea is still alive. Are you?" He had not responded immediately. He had walked outside instead, into the cold, clear air, and stood at the edge of the frozen fjord. The sun was low on the horizon, the way it stays in the Arctic winter, casting long shadows across the ice. He thought about the paper he had written, the models he had built, the years of work that had been called hubris. He thought about the young researchers who had worked with him, many of whom had been forced out of climate science because there was no funding for anything except more predictions. More warnings, more papers that nobody in power seemed to read. And he thought about the water. He could feel it, somehow, even here, thousands of miles from Antarctica. The way it was rising, not in a straight line, but in a series of lurches, each one worse than the last. He had spent his entire career measuring and predicting those lurches. Now they were here, and the people who had laughed at him were still in charge. Still talking about economics, still treating the ocean like it would wait for them to finish their debates. The second message came that night. It was longer. "We have the resources. We have the engineering. We have a vessel that can carry the equipment. What we need is the man who first saw the solution. The window is closing. If you want to come, you must leave within 72 hours. No contact with anyone. No records. If you are not at coordinates we send, we will assume you have chosen to stay." Aris had read the message 3 times. Then he had deleted it from the system, as instructed, and gone back to looking at his data feeds. The collapse of the Pine Island Glacier was accelerating. The warm water was carving tunnels under the ice faster than any model had predicted. In the city of Christchurch, New Zealand, which had become a hub for Antarctic research, the airport was flooded for the 3rd time that year. The news showed people wading through waist, deep water with their belongings on their heads. The third message came the next morning, just as Lena arrived for her weekly equipment check. She was a young woman with a practical manner, the kind of person who did not ask unnecessary questions. She noticed that Aris had already packed a small duffel bag, which was unusual because he rarely went anywhere. "Leaving?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Maybe," he said. "I'm not sure yet." She did not push. She did her work, checked the satellite feeds, made sure the data was still transmitting. Before she left, she stood at the door for a moment and looked back at him. "Whatever it is," she said, "I hope you go." He did not ask her how she knew. Some things he had learned did not need to be said. After she left, he sat at his desk and opened the third message. It contained a set of coordinates in the Amundsen Sea, far from any shipping lanes, and a final line. "The silence protocol is in effect. We leave in 48 hours. The world does not know it yet, but it needs you." Aris looked around the station. He had lived here for nearly a decade. The walls were covered with old charts and photographs of glaciers that no longer existed. A framed copy of his original paper hung above his desk, the one that had made him a laughingstock. He had kept it there as a reminder, though he was not sure anymore of what exactly. Maybe of the cost of being right too early, or maybe of the courage it had taken to write it in the first place. He stood up slowly, his joints aching from years of cold and hard travel. He took the paper off the wall and rolled it carefully, sliding it into his duffel bag. Then he sent a short reply. "I will be there." Within an hour, he had shut down the station's non-essential systems. He left the data feeds running. Someone, somewhere, would eventually notice the silence, but not for a while. He walked out into the Arctic twilight, locked the door behind him, and began the long walk toward the airstrip where a chartered plane was already waiting. Hidden from radar, its engines running behind him. The ice groaned and shifted, a sound he had known his whole life. But for the first time in years, he was not listening to it as a scientist who had been proven right. He was listening to it as a man who still believed, against all reason, that there was something he could do. The Armada was waiting. And the world, which had laughed at him for daring to dream of saving it, had no idea what was coming.